where we were last week and what we talked about last week was kind of an intro to the four loves, where we talked a little bit also about love as intimacy. Intimacy having three fundamental key components, which is self-awareness, vulnerability, and honesty. And for the most part, I would say that because of the human condition, most of us are going to struggle at various times in our life, and it might change with one or two of those different things. Usually most people are fairly strong in one. But we can struggle in all that. If you have no problems with any of these three things, then you are in the same category as Mary and Jesus, and I'm happy for you. But really, if we're honesty, actually I'd say if you also think that you don't struggle with any of them, you might have some problems with self-awareness. So, in terms of that, though, obviously this is not meant to just be a philosophical talk, although Lewis talked a lot about philosophy. But Lewis was asked why he wrote so much about religion and faith when he wasn't a cleric. And Lewis's response was, when clerics start writing in ways that the common man can understand, he would stop writing. It's the truth. Unfortunately, is that sometimes as clerics, as priests and bishops, is that we get so much education, we get so much academic formation that we can sometimes talk and leave things at a highfalutin level. And that's why many people like C.S. Lewis, because he's able to bring things down. But without bringing them down without losing their depth. When you look at the four loves in particular, and this is also why it's also important that when we're talking a lot about these things, so what I like to talk about is distinction without separation. It's important that we're able to distinguish things without entirely separating them. Because some people would say, well, vulnerability and self-awareness, they seem to be kind of the same thing. No, they're a little bit different, but they are interconnected. If you have problems with vulnerability, it can affect your self-awareness. If you have problems with honesty, it can affect your level of vulnerability. So these things are interconnected, but they're also distinctive. They have a different beginning point and a different ending point. Which is why it's important when you're doing things like this. We're also going to be talking about the four loves. Some people might say, well, you know what, A.R.C, Storge, Philia, Agape, a lot of these things seem to be interconnected. They are interconnected. That's kind of the whole point. But if you're having problems in one particular area of your life, it's important to be able to see which particular area it is. Because only then can you find the right solution to the problem. And this is why I know that many of you, I've seen many of your faces before in some of my other classes. If you take my St. Ignatius of Loyola class, Ignatius of Loyola talks about the same thing in much of his different writings, especially in Discernment of Spirits. He says that in order to have true self-awareness, he's like, you have to have realization of the difference between your emotional and your human relationships, the problems that stem from human relationships, versus your physical problems. And then you also have to be only a person who is wise and is learning in the ways of the faith, and they also then start being able to distinguish those things that are distinctively spiritual problems. It's also why Ignatius is talking about this, and they are interconnected. And Ignatius will talk about the same thing, that these three areas can be interconnected. For instance, if a person is experiencing a physical malady, they are more likely to enter into what's called emotional desolation. And they're also more likely to experience spiritual desolation. This doesn't have to be the case, but oftentimes these things do become blended. But if you find the wrong solution to a problem, then you're only going to have a continuation of the problem. That's why the example I like to use a lot is a teenage girl who's having a problem in her relationships with her boyfriend. Gets into a fight, right? So they're having a communication problem, or this can even be spouses, right? And then to make herself feel better, she goes and eats a half a gallon of ice cream. Right? That's a physical response to a relational problem. Or a person who tries to go to therapy to try to therapize their way away from their being overweight, and they're not willing to make any changes in their diet. Okay? There is a problem, and actually talking about things is sometimes the correct thing when you're having a relational problem, just as dieting is the correct thing when you're having a problem with being overweight or if you're sick. Sometimes people come to me and they ask me to pray for them for a particular disease. And I will most certainly pray for them, that the God will heal them. But I also want them to go to the doctor. And sometimes you'd be surprised. People will come to the priest and they're like, well, I don't want to go to the doctor. I just want you to pray. I want God to heal me. I'm like, well, God uses doctors too. Like God gave us both faith and he also gave us reason. He wants us to use both faith and reason, and that God wants to work, again, through the doctors who God has given them the wisdom and the skill to be able to address those areas of life which pertain to matters of medicine. Now, can God miraculously have a healing? We've seen that many times. Jesus himself is the healer. But Jesus also tells people to follow the prescriptions. He tells the lepers, now that you're clean, but still go and follow the prescriptions of the law. So in terms of distinction, that's also what I'm trying to hopefully get across from this point is, it is very, very important that we are able to distinguish and to look at things kind of in their separate areas. Because when you look at things in their separate areas, you can start saying, okay, well, maybe I feel like my life is chaotic. I have a lot of problems in a particular area of my life. But that's where if you don't have this distinction, like you can say everything in my life is going terribly. As opposed to, no, physically I'm doing okay. Spiritually I'm doing okay, but emotionally right now I'm having some real serious difficulties. See, if you blend all the things together, we're confronted with chaos, as well as we're confronted with insurmountable problems. But if you sometimes break things apart and look at them and distinguish where things come from, and the same thing is true in terms of love. And this is why this series on the four loves and why C.S. Lewis talked about the four loves, because he recognized that many people have problems in understanding and developing deeper relationships with love. And then the question becomes, when you say the word love, what are you talking about? Because we say, I love my cat, I love my dog, I love my car, I love my spouse, I love God, I love my country, I love all these different things we say. But distinguishing these types of love is very, very helpful. So, just a quick review of the names of the four loves. The first love is what's referred to as, my clicker. Hello, clicker. Come on, clicker. Hey, there you go. Friendship. The English of this would be called friendship, and this is what we'll talk about next week is friendship. But we're going to talk about the second one tonight, but friendship. Those things that we have in common, the things that bond us together by our commonalities, is that there are true things that unite us all together. But you can have a friendship with a person. You can also have a person who you really have nothing in common with. And this is the one we're going to focus on tonight, which is called storge. Storge, which is sometimes also translated affection. Affection, which is the bond of family love. Because you can have a sibling who you really, honestly, if you think about, do I have a friendship with a particular sibling? You might not. Does that mean you don't love them? No, you do, because you might have nothing in common with a brother or with a sister, but you still have a great, loyalty, a great love for them. And this is what is referred to as storge, is that it's also that which we have in common with animals, and what we see in the animal kingdom is that animals also participate in the being of God, which is why all things that are created have their own inherent dignity. All things, this was recently from Pope Francis's encyclical on Laudatio Si. Pope Francis talked about the Trinitarian nature of all things that have been created. All things that exist reflect God in some manner. Now, some things reflect God more than others, and that's why the human being, who is the highest reflection of God, the highest reflection of God that exists in the world, that's why John Paul II, as well as different saints throughout history, have called the human family is the icon of the Trinity in the world. It's the highest reflection. But just to say that human beings are the highest reflection, that we were created in the image and likeness of God, is not to devalue or take away from the intrinsic value of all other things that exist. This is why Francis is very clear in his encyclical that we can't just take nature, and we're not called to dominate nature and strip it, but we are called to be stewards of nature. We are called to be stewards and recognize that all things, even a bug, has intrinsic value. Now, you can use it properly, but it's also why nature itself has an intrinsic goodness. That's actually even from Genesis. Genesis, it talks about that all things that God created, even the most simplest of things, such as energy, light and darkness, seas, skies, the water, the earth. And after he creates all these different things on each of the days, he always says the same thing, which is that, and they created it, and it was good. It was good. And that there's a goodness to all that exists. This is actually different than what many people in the ancient world would have considered, because there was specifically in ancient Greek philosophers who were called the Gnostics, who believed that actually the material world was not good. They believed that actually matter itself, that the spirit was good, but the flesh was the source of evil. Which is interesting that Jesus kind of flipped some of these concepts that the people of that time were very familiar with on their head. He will say that the spirit is good. He said the spirit is good, but the flesh is weak. Jesus, though, directly goes against Gnosticism in its various forms, especially when God himself takes flesh, takes on a human body. This notion that God takes on a human body and therefore is very closely aligned to us by the nature that he has now, and God has adopted and taken on a human body. But in this, we find that nature itself, it's also when nature experiences evil. Hey, clicker. Right? Nature itself does experience the effects of evil. This is why in the Old Testament it also says that nature, the very stones, will cry out to God for the injustice which has been done against it. That actually in the book of Ezekiel, Isaiah, many of the prophets, it talks about that you have violated the land. Because there's a symbiotic relationship between the land, which God created and which has a natural inherent goodness, and what the people of Israel have done to the land. Specifically by polluting the land in the blood of their children. And that's with the sacrifice to Molech and the sacrifice to the Baals, when the people of Israel were sacrificing and were engaging in various different types of pagan rituals and pagan worship. That the land itself, it says that the land cried out to God for justice, and that the land vomited the people out, and that they were sent into exile because the land itself needed 70 years to heal itself from the offenses which the people of Israel brought against it. And so this symbiotic relationship between the land and the people of Israel, we also see reflected in this particular principle, the storge. Because storge, for the most part, is affection. And we should have actually a natural affection, not just for our families, but we should have a natural affection for what? Our country, for our homeland, for even the earth itself. Just curious, does anyone here garden? Okay, I was pulling weeds the other day and I have like ant bites up and down my hands now. Right? But why do we garden? It's because it's fun, but why is it fun? Because you watch things grow. But why do we like enjoying watching things grow? You nurture it, you protect it. Right? But it's also when you work, and actually the ancient understanding of work in the Old Testament, as well as actually in the New Testament, even to this modern time, our Judeo-Christian faith says that work itself is a way in which we participate in the creativity of God. That's why actually human beings have a fundamental right to work. Like we need to work. Because only when we work do we participate in the creativity of God, that God creates through our actions, and that we co-create with God. And so in this, though, you'll find that many things create, and they don't even really think about it. Actually, there's no thinking about it. You'll find that the earth fixes itself, and it is good. You'll find that animals with only minimal, if any, thought, or minimal, if any, feeling, that they themselves create. And that all of this, though, that God created all the reproducing species of the earth and said that it was good. Because for the most part, storge, if you were to link this to one of the transcendentals, and there's 4 transcendentals, there's truth, the things that, again, unite all things in common, truth, a commonality, that there's no deceptions or there's no separation in truth. But then the second transcendental is goodness. Yeah. And it's ways in which we touch the finger of God in the existing world. When we encounter truths, whether they be mathematical truths, whether they be truths of nature, that in some fashion or form we are being connected to God. But it's not just about truth. It's also about goodness. And actually, the funny thing about goodness, you can't really describe goodness. It's hard to actually, if you were to try to break goodness apart, it's really hard to really even talk about goodness. You just recognize it by experience. Like we participate in goodness by experience. This is also what even the school of phenomenology kind of looks at, is the notion of experiencing just the phenomena of experiencing things and that they are good. And so in the experience of things we find this goodness, this primary goodness. It's also when we experience things that should not happen. We also have a natural repulsion or natural repugnance against things that we also classify as the opposite of good would be evil. But evil is not something which exists. And evil is when a good thing has become corrupted. That's St. Augustine, who talks about that evil is not the opposite of good, in that there's like a good God and a bad God. That's called dualism. No, is that evil is when something which is good is prevented from becoming all that it can be. When its natural end, when it becomes perverted from its natural end, or prevented from achieving what it's meant to be. And it's good. And all things that exist, even things that do not have reason, experience and exist within the goodness of God's plan. The next one would be A.R.C. A.R.C, which is very different than Philia and Storge, because in this we find that A.R.C, although we do see obviously animals in nature that mate, they don't have a desire for the same type of union that human beings have a desire for. That this notion of A.R.C, also that A.R.C oftentimes is almost the exact opposite of friendship. Friendship, which is about commonalities, is that in A.R.C we experience oftentimes the beauty of life, something which is beautiful, different than ourselves, and yet we feel drawn to something which is so foreign. To a certain extent, and this is what we'll get into in the third week, or in 3 weeks from now, it would be the last one we'll finish with, will be A.R.C, but the notion of that actually within the erotic, the true erotic, which actually, even C.S. Lewis in his book, he makes a distinguish between fallen A.R.C, which he calls Venus, the goddess of the pagan goddess who doesn't bring and elevate one up, but actually brings one down and lowers one. But the difference between true A.R.C that God created and just the earthly carnal Venus. Because A.R.C is meant to be actually the most mature of all the loves, because it's also the most creative, and it has the most long-term consequences in terms of the creative power which is possible within the erotic. Then you get into the last and final one, which is Agape, which is that Agape is the type of love which comes directly from God himself, and that Agape is what we see most clearly upon the cross. That Jesus himself comes to show us what pure Agape looks like. But what's interesting upon the cross, you will find that on the cross, Jesus is dying for us, who he calls his friends. Right? That's what Jesus says. He says, I did not come to call you slaves. I came to call you as my friends. He's very clear that he came to unite all of us to God as brothers and sisters. That we are all called to be children of God, as brothers and sisters, one in the Lord. That he came to call us not just as friends, but as brothers and sisters. As well as that Jesus refers to the church. Every time that he refers to collective humanity. Almost always when he was referring to collective humanity, does anyone know what he refers to the church as? His bride. It's also what we say is that the church is the bride of Christ in a very large sense, not in an individual sense, but in a very large. It's the same sense that actually the ancient people of Israel, in ancient Israel, the people of Israel referred to themselves as the bride. That's why in like the book of Hosea, God compares Israel to an unfaithful bride. A bride who has constantly whored herself out with other false gods. That's why Hosea the prophet is actually told to go and to marry a prostitute whose name is Gomer. And that Gomer gives him forth 3 children, but Gomer keeps returning back to all of her former lovers. And that the story of Hosea and Gomer is this reflection of the people of Israel who constantly are breaking their covenant with God, but the notion of covenant is also a marital covenant. And so this divine sense where God divinely wants to be united to the entirety of humanity, this is also what the books of the Wisdom of Solomon refer to, or the Song of Solomon, which is the divine eros of how Solomon is speaking, but on the part of God, is that God desires to woo humanity and to pursue like a lover. Oh, hearken to me, my lover, like the young stag running across the fields. So this beautiful language, but ultimately in the erotic, we see though on the cross, we see that Christ is emptying himself out entirely upon the cross to unite the church to himself as bride, to open up the fonts of baptism, to make us all children of God and united as brothers and sisters, and to elevate and to raise us up so that we can not just be called slaves, but that we are also called friends. And actually I'd say that within these 3 relationships, friend, family, and lover, there's really no other human relationship that we really have outside those 3. At least not intimate relationships outside. You might think coworker. Well, your coworker is supposed to be your friend, right? You at least have something in common. Maybe not all your coworkers. It's dangerous, right? But you're not usually intimate with your coworkers, right? You don't have complete honesty, right? Otherwise you won't be in a job for very long, right? But within this though, agape. So what is agape? Agape is the very love of God, which is why there is a fourth transcendental, which is sometimes forgotten because we focus sometimes a lot on truth, beauty, and goodness. But there also is another transcendental, and it's called oneness. That agape, to a certain extent, makes all things one. And you can always tell when agape is present because agape will heal all divisions. Agape is what surmounts the insurmountable. It is the very raw power of God himself. And so actually, one of the reasons why we can also say that the presence of agape on the cross is an act of pure agape, because in this we find that Christ completely surrenders and offers everything back of himself to the Father, giving himself up for our sake, to uniting humanity to God. And that in the actions of Christ on the cross, there is a oneness which can occur. Which is why if you wanted I can give you lots of examples of Agape, of Eros and Philia and Storge. It's very hard for me to give you a concrete example of agape, with one exception: forgiveness. Forgiveness, because if you think about what does forgiveness practically speaking do, forgiveness heals divisions. It's also why if there is no forgiveness, there will always be eternal divisions or internal schisms. So, what Christ does upon the cross is to actually, I would say, open up and to infuse into each of these different loves. Once again, that we can experience this, because you can experience all of these loves without the lens of agape. Because you can replace these, and this is where we finished last week. You can take agape out and replace it with this, which is the exact opposite of agape. Because selfishness, self-inwardness, we're not existing for the other or for others, but existing for oneself. Because you can still have all those different loves which are devoid of true agape, which is why they become sources of suffering as opposed to sources of bliss. Does this make sense? Any questions on this so far? All right, so let's talk about for the rest. What's my time? 5:25? All right. Because I have mass at 6, so I can guarantee you we'll be done in time for mass. Well, mass won't start until I get there anyways. Gravity. Think about gravity for just a moment, right? It's one of the most primal, whatever you want to call it, forces, realities. Like we know that gravity is also one of the things that keeps us from spinning off into the middle of outer space and all freezing or burning to death. Right, gravity, the gravitational pull. But in gravity, if you look at gravity which is also a part of God's plan. Like gravity is not an accident, although some atheist scientists would want you to believe this. Although if you look at the actual possibilities, the numerical possibilities of everything existing in the perfect balance that it exists right now, and for there to be actually life, it is impossible. This is why people like Einstein, who wasn't necessarily a faithful person or thought about that there was a God, he did see that there was an order to the universe. And Einstein said that if there was a God, he said, we are like children in the middle of a giant library. He was like, and I can't read many of the books in the universe, many things I can see around me, but I can see that there's an order to it. There's a system, there's a schema. And in this, he said, that points to me that there has to be, if there's order, there's someone who ordered it. Which is as close as Einstein would get to the possibility of God, but even the recognition of that when you look at the physical material world as well as the properties of physics and things like this, you'll notice that there is an order to them. If you look at gravity has some interesting properties, is that it draws bodies together. That's why if there's no gravity, you start spinning off into space. If you saw the movie Gravity, which came out a couple of years ago, it was actually very, very interesting about a person who is not in proximity, not in relationship to anything around it. Actually, even the danger of slipping off into the infinite void, where there's nothing around you. It's just you, yourself, and I. The unholy trinity. Right? But in that, think about that for a moment. If you were in a spacesuit, and all of a sudden you got far enough away from the Earth that there was no longer the gravitational pull, and that you therefore also lost contact with your space station and things like that, and you just started spinning out into the infinite void of space. Like if you were to spend like 15 minutes just pondering that, yeah, it's terrifying. Absolutely, it's tremendously brave. But why? Because they're not in proximity. We were created for proximity. We were created because also in proximity, especially for beings that have bodies, we were created for bodily proximity. And we see this just in the force of gravity. Gravity shows us that proximity is actually a good thing, because if you start spinning off, do you know what the consequences of a person who spins off into space is? That they are entirely alone. It's actually the most terrifying point of actually even pondering the fact of spinning off into space until finally you die, but that you would die all alone. But what? In relationship to nothing. See, that's not what God created us for. God created us to be in constant proximity. Also, to be in relationship, because to be in relationship means that there is the other. Not just the self, but that there is an other. And this is actually the relationship that all of us were conceived in. Is that we were conceived in the relationship, God willing, although now science is trying to give us other opportunities, other possibilities where this does not have to be the case. But organically, like each and every one of us, most likely in this room, was the result of the proximity of two bodies that collided. Right? And in that proximity of bodies, which is hopefully was a act of what? Of self-gift and love. Was this notion that we were created in proximity. And therefore, when the zygote is created, and when you have an embryo that then starts to germinate within the womb of the mother, is that for the next 9 months, you are in constant proximity to another body. And this is long before you ever have reason. This is long before you ever have even the ability to appreciate what's going on and the sacrifices that your mother is making. Again, and I'm very grateful to my mother and for every mother out there, because everyone who was born a child, my sisters now are bearing children, and I see the pain and the difficulty that goes along with pregnancy, like in the morning sickness, all that goes along with that. And it's a great sacrifice. It's a great act of love, which is actually, I believe, that where we see one of the most profound instances of God's love manifesting in the world today is in maternity. That actually, I would say that maternity, the maternal instinct, the maternal love, is one of the strongest, if not the most strongest and powerful force that exists on planet Earth. Because without it, we would all be dead. We all would not be here, correct. Thank God for mothers, right? And even in the scriptures talk about, in Hebrew, there's a very distinctive word which is used to refer to the love of a mother for her child. And this is one of the words in Hebrew. There's 7 words, or 7 to 9 words for the word compassion. Compassion, also translated as mercy. In Greek, there's 2. In English, we have 1. But again, the Hebrews broke it down much more so. But in the Hebrew, you'll find that the word compassion is oftentimes translated, especially when it's referred to in the maternal, it's called rakam. The rakam, that even if a mother forgets her child, I will not forget my rakam for you. This is what God says, that his rakam for the human race, his rakam for Israel, that what? I fondled you upon my lap. I nurtured you at my breast. He said, and if everyone else forgets you, and you're forgotten by all, I will never forget you. And you will never be entirely alone. And so this rakam, which is actually what you can find, especially in what the concept is of storge, this is the relationship that we are born into. And it doesn't take any thought, right? It's an experience. It's also why when children are prevented from having a rakam, or when children don't have rakam, horrible things happen in their developmental process. That if a mother is not present in a child's life, there's oftentimes long-standing issues that will develop where they'll end up oftentimes in therapy for many, many years. Because everyone needs a mother. And everyone needs that distinctive love which is present with a mother, because that's where we were adjusted, that's where we were created, and that's why people have desires for it to be what? To just be held, just to be nurtured, just to be what? Bonded to. It's actually why the bonding which happens between, we have no clue. Even right now, we're only beginning to understand the type of effect that actually happens to a child in utero. Now we know that chemically, we know that biologically and chemically, that a mother's biological makeup can affect the biological makeup of the child. For instance, if she's on drugs, heroin, we know the child will what? That will be transmitted to the child. We also know that what? We have no clue, though, what the emotional impact. We have no clue what the impact that actually happens with child, but we can see what indicators of things that went wrong along the way when things go bad. We can also see great and beautiful things when motherhood is intact and when people experience from the very beginning a profound overflowing of what's referred to in Greek as storge. Does this make sense? So within storge, you'll find that, again, the relationship, especially between mother and child, but also between brother and sister, that this relationship that we have from the very beginning, it's also what God says in the Old Testament. He says, before you were fashioned and formed in your mother's womb, I knew you. Connotation being, I loved you. Which is why this notion that what happens in the womb is not really human life has no basis whatsoever in Scripture. And I'd also say it has no basis in reason. It's not reasonable either. But in this notion, though, is you'll have that the relationship between mother and child, what you find in the ancient world is that this was held in high, high regard. It's why the virtues, and again, Psalm 139, you knit me together in my mother's womb, and that God gave us both a mother as well as a father. Again, two halves of humanity about which if you're missing one of those halves, something will always be exactly that, missing. Can you survive without a mother? Yes. Can you survive without a father? Yes. But will there always be something which was missing? Yes. Because there's something which both a father and which a mother give to their child, and the child receives from both the mother and from the father, which is distinct and unitive, and which actually is healthy for the development of the child. We know that just from psychological studies. So in that, we also see that the relationship between father and child is one of the most profound, because this is what turns a boy into a man, at least ideally, when he actually embraces being a father as opposed to siring. And there's a big difference between fathering a child and siring a child, because you can sire many persons without ever being a father to them, because a father is something deeper. A father is not less about blood as it is about relationship. A father is a person who teaches, just as a mother is a person who nurtures and teaches as well. And so in this, one of the greatest things that the parents pass on and teach to their children before they ever have cognition is that they teach them they are loved, they are lovable, and that they have always been wanted. And this is something that children hopefully grow up in. And when you see children growing up in a healthy and stable and happy home life, you see that they flourish. They flourish in school, they flourish in life, again, until they hit about the age of 5 or 6, right? Maybe a little bit before that, you might say 3 or 4, but still, that we see that children have this fundamental need, which is why within this storge, it's also where you find that the love between a husband and his wife, which is the last stage, but still gives birth to what? A third person. Okay, you can think about that connotation. That's not an accident. That's a way in which we distinctively were created in the image and likeness of God. And so within this, you also find it's what exists within the animal kingdom. You'll find that the animal kingdom also participates within the storge of God, within the storge which exists, because animals display some of the exact same tendencies. We see that actually in nature, that many female creatures in nature will actually die protecting their young. It's instinctual. It's built into the fiber of nature. That even a pelican, and it's actually why in the early church the pelican was a sign and symbol of the church, because a pelican will actually take off, if it has no food to give to their children, the pelican will strip off its own flesh and will feed their children with its own flesh. That we see that the female crocodile, you don't think about crocodiles as being overly maternal, right? But crocodiles, female crocodiles, will actually starve to death protecting their nest. Right? And so that's what? The good of the child, the good of the spawn, the good of the offspring, even to the point where actually the parent, again, is willing to lay down everything. And we see this, naturally speaking, without anything which even has the ability to understand what they're doing. It's just found in nature. And you know what? It is good. Within nature and within storge, you'll find that it is rooted in the good. you'll find that actually problems in Storge is usually problems that have developed with a lack of proximity. So why actually in this you'll find that especially in those early developmental stages, in those early developmental years, that you'll find that proximity. It's why if you do not have a father who's in proximity, or if you do not have a mother who is in proximity, that there can be problems with how the child develops. There's always a missing, a lack, a want in both of those areas. It's constant, it's stable. It's also meant to be entirely inclusive, right? You didn't get a choice. You didn't get to pick who was in your family. Have you ever thought about that? I didn't get to pick because if I had picked, I might not have chosen that person to be in my family. Now maybe you do. Maybe you're thinking that's a horrible thing to say, Father Tom. But I'm sorry, that's common human experience. Sometimes, especially those siblings that you don't always get along with, you're just like, why did God place us in the same family, right? Because like everything, but what? But if you start picking on my family, that same person that I have a problem with, what? You'll find the bond of blood, the bond of loyalty, the loyalty between brothers and sisters. Actually, my family, I could torture and I could torture my sisters and they could beat me up and things like that. But if someone in the school hit me, you had to deal with 6 sisters. Okay? Or if you said something against one of my sisters, you had to then deal with me. All right, what? We find it, and you'll find that this is something which is instinctual because it's something which is, to a certain extent, irrational. And why do I say irrational? Because you don't have to think about it. You don't have to process it. It just is. Which is also why I would say it's rooted in primarily the good. Now, is this distinct? Is it meant to be distinct and separate from truth and from beauty? No, it's meant to be one and the same. It's meant to be connected. But when you're having this, it's something which is primal. It's something which is instinctual. If you heard my homily today, it's partially also what I'm talking about in terms of the homily today, with Jesus being the Lion of Judah, who protects his church. You'll find this ferociousness, the ferocity of Storge. Actually, Lewis will talk about the ferocity of Storge as being a beautiful and a good thing, unless it becomes corrupted by selfishness. Because you can have Storge, which is beautiful and good, but if it's corrupted by selfishness, it can become extremely, extremely damaging. Yeah, well, jealousy would be one of the primary ways in which Storge becomes corrupted. Another one that actually C.S. Lewis talks about a lot is that Storge, the natural tendency with things that are good, it's all right, the natural tendency that when we have something which is good, what do you want when something is good and you have it in your hands, what do you want to do with it?
Share it. Protect.
Hold on to it. Yeah. Like when you have a really good hug, right? You want to hold on to it, right? When you have a beautiful relationship, you want to hold on to it, right? Things which are good, you don't want to let go of the good. Why would you want to let go of the good, right? That's also why the tendency is that we sometimes hold on to the good so much that we actually crush the life out of it. This is actually what C.S. Lewis talks about in the book when he talks about Storge, which is beautiful and good. He talks about this mother she's the best mother in town. Talks about that she takes care of her family. She cooks them 3 square meals a day. They have tea ready for them all the time. And that actually it's always perfect. Her house was always clean. She was the perfect homemaker. Nothing was ever out of sorts. She always made sure that she took care of her sickly daughter, who was always sickly and always had to be pampered and taken care of. That her son, she was always pining for her son, who had not treated her well and had abandoned them, but she was always pining and talking about her son, how much she loved her son and wanted her son to come home. That her husband, who wasn't doing the work, but she would do double the work and do the things for her husband, who was kind of a layabout, and everyone in the town considered to be was kind of lazy. And even the dog was like the most loved and cherished dog in the town, who had like clothing and had all this different stuff. Right? So what is he what is Lewis referring to? He's talking to the overbearing mother. The mother who's holding on to her children. And this can also be obviously true for fathers, although we see it sometimes, it's more kind of in the cultural sense as well as it's obviously when you see it with mothers. But this tendency sometimes of not wanting to let go of our children. Not wanting to let go, because there's also a notion that if you let go, you have no control. So we want to hold on. Now see, if Storge is well ordered, then actually we know that, again, if we trust God, that we know that if we have to let go of something, that's okay. But see, the natural tendency, especially if you have fear which enters into Storge, the natural tendency sometimes is to hold on and to not want to let go. And is it because the person wants to control and screw up their children's lives? No. It's because they want to hold on to the good. Does that make sense? So is it from a sense of malice or of evil? No. It's more often than not from a sense of fear and from a sense of what? The fear of loss, or what will happen if I let go. And there can sometimes be a desire in Storge to sometimes overly control. That's why you see even in nature that animals will kick their young out of the nest. That there's a certain point where the child in the nature, once it's been raised, it has to fend for itself. And that this is part of nature. It's actually something which is good. That's why Lewis also talks about how everyone was so surprised that when this most perfect mother, whatever, I forget, Miss McCarran or something like that, when she died unexpectedly, everyone was horrified because they didn't know what was going to happen to everyone, all the family who had been taken care of so well for so many years. But for some reason, when she died, the sickly daughter was not quite so sick as everyone thought. The son who had been away for so many years, all of a sudden he was back and having fun with all of his friends again. That the husband who was a layabout actually became an upstanding member of the community who had actually empowered himself and was making real substantial changes. And he says, and even the dog seemed to be happier. Right? But it's that sense, like what happens when Storge goes wrong? And the primary thing with Storge is rooted in the good. But the good needs absolutely to be rooted in the allowance of something to become something new and beautiful. But see, if you only want to hold on to the good, which is sometimes our tendency, or as it says in Scripture, to grasp. See, if you grasp onto something and you can't let it go, and it's also why St. Ignatius talks about within Storge, is that with Storge you have to have the realization that all things are good, but you should hold all things with an open hand. That you should be willing to, at any given time, that whatever is good in your life, if God is taking something away from us, that it's only to replace it with something which is better. Which is that if you hold on, the parent who holds on to their child, or the child who hangs on to their parent and won't let go of their parent, oftentimes out of a sense of fear. Out of a sense of fear. And so they want to hold on to that parent. But that actually, if you hold on too tightly, they will never become what? The parents themselves that they're called to be. They will never arrive and to become what? The new person that God has created them to be. That we were created not to be in a static state, but to be in a constantly growing state. And for growth, there sometimes also has to be a recognition that there is freedom. Does this make sense? So in Storge, again, we started a little bit late today, so I'm going to have to cut it off because it's 5:45. It's meant to be inclusive, which will be different than the other loves as we come to see. Storge, you don't have a choice. It's also why when people they want to kick certain people out of their families, you can't really do that. Like family is meant to be inclusive. Also why when people want to kick people out of the church, right? We don't kick people out of the church. The church is entirely inclusive, but healthily inclusive. You can be kicked out of the church. It's called excommunication. Just like you can what? You can be kicked out of your parents' house for not abiding by the rules, right? And that's good and healthy because what? Storge is rooted in healthy boundaries as well. It's also why when you see Storge with unhealthy boundaries, that's where you'll find abuse, various types of abuse in the family. But what is that? That's when what? When truth has been separated from Storge. When no longer is the recognition of healthy boundaries, that there is an order to reality. And yet it's meant to be something which is also consistent. Storge, for the most part, stays consistent and should stay consistent. Do you really grow in your love of your family? I mean, maybe, but really you just love your family. It's an overwhelming, it's an instinctual love. You have to really screw someone up for them not to love their family. Which, unfortunately, because of sin, sometimes happens. That's why I have kind of it's a horrible, I mean, it's a saying. It's that the greatest dream of a boy is to become like his father. The greatest nightmare of a man is sometimes to become like his father. Right? But in that, when things work out well and when Storge is good, the greatest dream of a boy is to become like his father, and the greatest dream is when actually it becomes actualized and the son becomes like the father. And the same thing can be said with mothers. This is what Storge was meant to be because it's by proximity. It's also why long-distance relationships, or when people are away, there's not that proximity, there's not that constant relationship, because this is where you'll find that this is a bodily reality. And we experience this not just by thoughts, not just by ideas, but especially by actions. Because you can see and you can evaluate storge in terms of the actions. It's what St. Paul also was talking about, or St. James was talking about, is that faith without works, what? That there is a value to works. Value to works in terms of being able to evaluate relationships. Something which is irrational, but fierce and powerful. Something which is primal, it's also instinctual, and it's something which is built into our very nature, and which we participate. It's also why I say that if you think you have a bond of friendship with your dog, okay, we'll get to friendship next week, you'll see really what you really have is storge. Because storge is good. It's what bonds things together, and it acts as that spiritual or that emotional bonding agent which actually brings all things together and makes them part of the same plan. It's also why, though it needs storge separated onto itself, and if it becomes distinct and separated, it can actually become something which is very dangerous. That's why it needs the other types of loves, as well as goodness cannot be good unless it is connected to both truth and to beauty. And that's how you can actually evaluate, is something actually healthy or not, because if it starts becoming separated, so like for me it's my good, yes, but it's not true that this is good for this person. It's where it becomes clingy or graspy. Does this make sense? So as we come to next week, so storge, again, you find storge goes wrong. I don't know if you guys recognize this guy, right? That's storge. It's storge gone wrong. Okay? If you saw this movie, right? Storge gone wrong. What? He won't let go of his little girl, even to the point where he's willing to torture and torment, again, her future spouse. He can't let go of his mom. That's why he becomes Psycho in Alfred Hitchcock's. There's a new movie. This one was all about polluted family relationships. So Jupiter Ascending, which is a popular movie among kids today. You saw like the Twilight movies, right? So storge becomes sickly and stifling when held on to unnaturally and when prevented from expanding into something which is new and beautiful, which is why it needs that. Next week we'll come back as we come to friendship, and we talk a little bit more about the most spiritual of all the loves, because what we just talked about to a certain extent was the most material, most physical of all the loves. This next week will be the most spiritual of all the love, which we call philia. Let's close with a prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time to come together. We ask you, Lord, to help us to internalize what we have heard, to take those truths which you've revealed to us, and to help us to see how these apply and how we can grow deeper in our lives in love with you. We ask you, Lord, that for those of us preparing for the Eucharist, to open up our hearts to receive you in a more profound way. And for those of us who are going home, we ask you for safety on the roads and safety for our families. We ask all this through the intercession of the words of the Our Father. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Go in the peace of Christ, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.